Hello everyone, my name is Mark Littler and I am the owner and editor-in-chief of The Whiskey Wash, and I'm also the owner of Mark Littler Limited. Now, if you're new to this channel, hello, but if you're not, you will know that I have done a huge amount of work in the past about trying to safeguard whiskey cask investments. And it seems a lot of those efforts have not done particularly much, because pretty much recently, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, London City Police have been executing search warrants at a London cask investment company. They've raided a premises with a search warrant. The ASA, the Advertising Standards Authority, have had to weigh in and basically try and govern the lies that these cask investment companies were putting out. And the FBI even arrested a guy a couple of years ago, Casey Alexander, and I believe that is about to sort of come to prosecutions, or he's been convicted. They're coming around to sentencing soon. So look, whiskey casks are a really bad investment, aren't they? Well, no. There are a lot of bad people in the cask investment world, and this is why I'm going to give you 3 tips if you're looking to buy a cask of whiskey this year. Now, let's just preface this by saying casks are still a very good investment, but there's 3 things that you need to do to make a very good cask investment. First of all, you need to pay a fair price for it. If you're going to pay triple the market value for a cask, there's no point in even considering that as an investment. It just isn't. You're just being scammed. It's just fraud. You've got to invest time. You can't buy these casks if you cannot afford to put your money away for at least 5 or 10 years, or in the cases of new make, longer. And you've got to own the cask that you buy. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Now, when I say you've got to own the cask that you buy, you might think that something like that is pretty straightforward. You've bought a cask from a company, you've got a certificate, you've got a contract, you've got this and that. Means nothing. You could have certificates to a piece of thin air. Now, when all the ways in which cask investment has been done right, and I've helped hundreds, probably close to 1,000 people exit their cask investments that they bought in the 1990s and early 2000s. And the key thing that all of these people have done, and the reason why somebody like me is able to help them sell their cask, is that at the warehouse where that cask is stored, it's their name on it, and it's not managed by a third party. They can call up at any time to check the cask details, or get a regauge, or get samples. So you need this full autonomy. Now, if somebody is saying to you, well, yeah, the contract is this and the contract is that, and your invoice represents this, well, yes, absolutely fine. As a theoretical exercise, your contract and invoice are all you need to prove to a liquidator or whatever that cask is yours if the company disappears. Yeah, but hang on a minute. I've just helped a customer who bought a cask in that manner, and the cask did exist at the warehouse at one point, and subsequently that company has now disappeared, and subsequently that cask has disappeared with the company too. So those certificates and those contracts are meaningless. You need your name on the cask at the warehouse. Now, this is normally done with a delivery order. And one of the reasons why a delivery order, there's no legislation anymore about needing a delivery order, but what a delivery order does, it transfers the ownership from the seller to the buyer and is recognized by the warehouse. So a delivery order is essentially a countersigned document. The seller will sign it, the buyer will sign it, and then the warehouse keeper, which is the person who's running the warehouse that the cask is stored in, will process it and transfer it from the one person to the other. So this new person's, the buyer's, responsible for all of the rent and the insurance going forward. Now, there's a very good reason for transferring the ownership like that, because of Excise Notice 196 Section 5.8, because of Excise Notice 197 Section 8.2 and 8.3, and because of the Warehouse Keepers and Owners of Warehouse Goods Regulations 1999 Statutory Instance number 1278 Part 5 Section 9.3, i.e. the laws governing cask ownership, say that you've got to tell the warehouse keeper every time a cask is sold, and that's a responsibility for the buyer and the seller. And if that isn't being done, then you could argue that the company is breaking the law, because they are not following the guidelines and the WAUGA requirements that they have said. So tip number 1, pretty simple: take ownership of your cask. If you can't take ownership of the cask, just stop the purchase, just walk away, because these other points are going to be irrelevant if you don't actually own what you've bought. So the second one is buy it cheap. And there's cheap, and I think we've got to have a discussion here about trade rates versus private rates. Look, distilleries produce thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of casks of whiskey each year. You buying 5 casks, you buying 20 casks, which you probably shouldn't be doing anyway, would still be considered a super inconsequential order to the trade. So if you think that you're going to start getting trade rates by buying 1 cask or 2 casks, you're completely wrong. So you will always pay more than the trader paying. But the point is how much more are you being exploited by the company selling it to you? That's the key thing here. Now, to give you sort of like some rough parameters here, the only types of casks that I would recommend to a new or like somebody who's not done cask investment before or hasn't got hundreds of thousands of pounds that they can just risk, because whiskey investing is incredibly risky, it's not regulated like your traditional stocks and shares, etc., is spend, okay, right, new make. New make is one option, and a cask, a 200 litre barrel of new make will probably cost a consumer between £2,000 and £3,000. It will cost the trade less than that, of course it will, but they're probably buying a tanker of it, not just 1 cask of it. So £2,000 or £3,000 is enough to get you a barrel of new make spirit. Now, a barrel of new make will probably have to be kept until it's at least 18 to start seeing a real significant jump in its price. Sure, there will be incremental jumps along the way, but they'll be small. And the best way to look at that is, okay, 12-year-old Macallan is £70 a bottle, 18-year-old Macallan is £350 a bottle, and 25-year-old Macallan is £2,000 a bottle. So the value of Macallan in bottle price, which is completely irrelevant to cask pricing in most ways, but you can see the value more than triples between 12 years old and 18-year-old. So if you're buying a cask of new make whiskey, you really want to be taking it through to 18 to start seeing some incredible or some significant price jumping. Now, if you've got a little bit more money to spend, 2 to 3 grand is fine for a barrel of new make. Let's say that you're looking for a barrel of slightly older stock, because again, if 12-year-old Macallan is only £70 a bottle, this whole period of time between, should we say, 0 and 12 is a relatively cost-effective place to buy whiskies, especially if you're looking at between, say, 5 and 8 years old, 5 and 10 years old. And again, for barrels, you'd probably be expecting to pay between £4,000 and £7,000 for a cask of that age. Now, these casks obviously have to be held for a shorter period of time. So let's say that you bought an 8-year-old cask of whiskey today, you only have to wait 10 years for that to hit 18, rather than the 18 years that you would have to wait if you were buying new make. So they do offer that advantage, but it is almost double the entry price, so it kind of doubles the risk. So it depends on how much time you've got and how much money you've got. I would never say go and buy a really aged 10, 15-year-old cask, 10, 20-year-old cask of whiskey as your first cask, unless it's 1, incredibly cheap, or 2, you are incredibly wealthy, and therefore that £25,000 price tag, for argument's sake, is like what most people's 2.5 grand of new make would be. So they would be my caveats for you. Now, finally, my third tip, and this is really important, and I don't think people really understand the importance of this, is get naming rights. And what do I mean by this? Okay, so naming rights basically mean that you can say on the bottle of whiskey, let's use a silly example, distilled at the Macallan distillery. Now, under trademark law in the UK, you cannot trademark a geographic location. So by saying distilled at the Macallan distillery, you're not infringing on the Macallan's trademarks. They cannot trademark the Macallan distillery, because you're saying this whiskey was distilled at the Macallan distillery, and therefore under trademark law, you cannot trademark that location. Absolutely fine. Now, what most distilleries will do, and those of you familiar with wine investment will know, let's say, for instance, you get secondary wine. So you've got Chateau Latour as the first wine, and then you've got Let's Latour as the second wine. Now, distilleries will release the identical product under a different name without naming rights, because this is what you would normally sell on to blenders, etc. So it's the same whiskey, but you can't piggyback on the branding of that whiskey. Now, in the most extreme example, Macallan might just be sold as Highland single malt, and that's probably what it would be sold for into the blending trade. So let's say that you wanted some Macallan whiskey for your blend, and you were buying a heck of a lot of volume here, it would be sold under Highland single malt whiskey, no naming rights whatsoever. There is this greater use of secondary distillery names by distilleries, and also by other companies that are selling these casks to try and make consumers feel that they're buying a good thing. I would always say, never buy a cask with naming rights. And here's two very good examples using basically the same distillery. So back in the day, probably about 10 years ago, Bunnahabhain, the Islay distillery, used to sell their secondary spirit under the name of Ardnahoe. Now, Ardnahoe is the name of the loch that sits just behind the distillery, and it was, I don't know if it was the water source or not, but it sits just behind the distillery of the Bunnahabhain distillery. So you could go and buy a cask of Ardnahoe, and therefore that when you bottled it, people would saying Ardnahoe would go, oh yeah, that's a secondary name for Bunnahabhain, that's fine. But somebody came along and took the trademark for Ardnahoe, as in the Ardnahoe distillery came along, who are just also behind Ardnahoe Loch on Islay, and they took that trademark. So if you bought a cask of Ardnahoe distilled at the Bunnahabhain distillery, you now can't call it Ardnahoe without infringing Ardnahoe's trademark. So you've basically got a cask of Islay single malt whiskey, basically blending stock. No one would really care about it. Now, who would take the trademarks? Well, look, have you got a cask of Stoisha? Anybody out there? Stoisha is the name that Bunnahabhain then used to call their spirits of, their secondary spirit of Bunnahabhain. But CVH Spirits have just this year in 2024 taken out the trademark for the word Stoisha. Now, I do not know how friendly or hostile they will be for anybody who has bought casks of Stoisha. For instance, you might be able to write to the distillery and say, look, can I still call my whiskey Stoisha? But something fundamental has changed. When it was called Stoisha without a trademark, you were not infringing anybody's trademark by saying Stoisha. But now that it is trademarks, you are infringing trademarks, so you may as well call it Bunnahabhain. It's the same level of trademark infringement. Now, the risk here is that, okay, yeah, absolutely fine. You've got a letter here to say that all is good and you can call it Stoisha. What happens in 10 years' time when the distillery or the owners have changed hands again and they go, nah, we're not going to give them use of this trademark, so let's let them go. So buying whiskey under a secondary name is incredibly risky, and I would never, ever recommend it. So there are my 3 tips for whiskey cask investment in 2024. Number 1, take ownership of your cask. Number 2, buy it cheap or relatively cheap. And number 3, make sure that you're getting naming rights.